I was reading today that Mr. Rumsfeld used to refer to them as the so-called occupied Palestinian territories, but it's not so-called and it's not disputed, says the World Court. Number two, the question of the settlements, the 460,000 settlers that Israel has transferred to the West Bank and previously to Gaza. What is their status under international law? Again, the World Court says it's just not controversial. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states unambiguously, or as lawyers like to say, in plain language, that it's inadmissible for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory. And therefore, the World Court says, quoting the United Nations Security Council resolutions, that the settlements in the occupied territory constitute a flagrant violation of international law. Full stop. Number three, we're often told that the question of East Jerusalem is, apart from the question of the refugees, the most complicated to resolve. And it's true, if you read the record of Camp David, it's probably correct to say that the refugee question, the Jerusalem question was the toughest nut to crack. There was a huge amount of energy invested in trying to resolve that particular question at the practical level. But legally, there is no issue at all. How did Israel acquire East Jerusalem? It acquired East Jerusalem in exactly the same manner as it acquired the West Bank and Gaza. It acquired East Jerusalem in the course of a war. And under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Therefore, Israel has no title to East Jerusalem. If you read the court decision, it's very explicit. It refers to the West Bank, comma, including East Jerusalem, comma, and the Gaza Strip as occupied Palestinian territory. No dispute, no question, no controversy, no complexity. Now, even that is really only part of the story. First of all, World Court, international court decisions are often quite close. It works basically like our own Supreme Court. Cases rise to the top, so to speak, because they bear on controversial issues which are close legally. That's why they reach the Supreme Court. And as everyone in this room knows, Supreme Court decisions are often quite close, as are our World Court decisions. So you take one which you would think is a no-brainer. Let's say 1996, Physicians for Human Rights submits a question to the World Court on the legality of nuclear war, or the use of nuclear weapons. I think the technical term was the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Now, the fundamental principle of the laws of war, as everyone in this room knows, is the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. And it would seem to be pretty obvious that insofar as nuclear weapons are incapable of distinguishing between civilians and combatants by their nature, they're indiscriminate weapons, insofar as they're incapable of distinguishing between civilians and combatants, you would think it's obvious they are illegal under international law, their use. No, the World Court was a very close vote, and the tie-breaking vote was cast by the president of the court. So even when you would think something would be fairly straightforward, it was not. I don't particularly agree with the decision of the court, but it was actually a quite interesting decision, and the dissents were, especially by this fellow Judge Viramantri, were very interesting to read. Why do I mention it? Because when you come to the World Court advisory opinion on these complicated issues to which I just referred, the vote wasn't close at all. It was 14-1. the one dissenting vote by the American judge Thomas Bergenthal, to which I'll return to in a moment. It was not a close vote. These are not, under international law, complicated questions. These are tenets, fundamental principles of international law, which were being tested in the advisory opinion. Or you could look at it from another angle. World court decisions or opinions, when you take what's called the majority opinion, the separate opinion, the declaration, and the dissents, they can be quite substantial. So I was reading the 1984 World Court opinion when Nicaragua went to the court because the United States was mining the harbors of Nicaragua. People of a previous generation will remember that. When you look at the full compendium, separate opinions, majority opinions, and so forth, it comes to a hefty 1,000 pages. And one day in the past, when I was a professor, I got to late at night when no one was around, print it out on my university printer. Now I can't do those things anymore, unfortunately. But you got, they are quite hefty. What's interesting about this particular advisory opinion of the court, if you take all the opinions, and there were quite a few separate opinions, and Mr. Bergenthal's separate declaration, it comes to less than 100 pages. And it comes to less than 100 pages for a very simple reason. These are not complicated questions. Even you take the case of Judge Bergenthal himself. He does not issue a dissent. In the nomenclature of the court, you can issue majority opinion, separate opinion, and then the dissent, and in the middle is something called a declaration, the declaration being more neutral. Even the American judge, he was very cautious. He issues a declaration, not a dissent. And in his declaration, he begins by saying, there is much in the majority opinion with which I agree. And then he goes on to look at what's probably the most, not controversial, but most critical question, namely the issue of those settlements. Because were there no settlements, there'd be no conflict. And Mr. Bergenthal says, well, I have to agree. Under Article 49, those settlements are illegal. And he says, if Israel is building the wall in order to protect the settlements, then he says, I'm using his language, ipso facto, the wall is illegal. And therefore, what we find is, on the most controversial questions, and of the most controversial of the controversial questions, it's 15-0. There's no controversy whatsoever. And that obviously raises, again, the obvious question. If what I'm saying is true, then how do we account for all of this alleged controversy swirling around the Israel-Palestine conflict? Before I look at that, I want to, in the time that allows me, which is obviously limited, to go through the record on the three areas which are the substantive areas of the conflict, to put in nursery school language, the past, the present, and the future. So let's first look at the past, the history. I notice in this room there are some people who are roughly of my age cohort. I can detect them from their tie-dyed shirts, their love beads, that glazed over look in their eyes, still saying give peace a chance, still wishing they were Sonny Bono with Cher. And for those who harken back to those wonderful days of the 60s, which are not over, they will remember that probably the question in the historical record that used to generate the most controversy, the most dispute, was, how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948?